Thank you for inviting me to speak at Stillpoint and for the opportunity to discuss my new book, Misogyny and Psychoanalysis. I would like to speak about some of the themes addressed in the book, and primarily I argue that misogyny hides in plain sight in the discipline, teaching and practice of psychoanalysis. I say this from the perspective of someone who's undertaken different psychoanalytic trainings. I'm a practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapist and am the former chair of a psychotherapy training organisation. I would also like to highlight that when I use the terms male and female, I'm referring to anyone who identifies with those terms. To look at the current context of misogyny and psychoanalysis, I would like to briefly talk about the origins of psychoanalysis, as this is key to where we are now. This historical context is not to further join the many criticisms of Freud's phallocentric view of psychosexual development, but more to show the long shadow these theories threw on the women at the time and subsequent generations. As you may already know, the story of psychoanalysis began with men trying to understand women through the study of hysteria, and more significantly through the lens of male experience, with male experience being seen as the norm. This picture may be familiar to you. It is well known for being situated above Freud's couch in Hampstead, London, and is an homage to the origins of the staging of his consulting room. In the picture, we see the French neurologist Charcot taking centre stage in his lion's den at Salpêtrière Hospital. He is giving one of his famous lectures about women with hysteria. He stands addressing his all-male audience, whilst his medical specimen, a woman, being supported to stand by another man, reclines backwards in a semi-conscious state. This picture is an open statement about the position of women at this time. They are there to be interpreted and understood by the men around them, with the supposition that the men know better than the women themselves. What is fascinating about Freud and psychoanalysis is that Freud and what he was proposing and conceptualizing was beyond groundbreaking. It was revolutionary, describing the existence of an unconscious and pushing all the societal norms by placing sexuality in young children and describing young children's sexual desire for their parents. And yet, when it came to patriarchal attitudes and values, the thinking seemed to stop and a blind spot emerged. Two of the fundamental cornerstones of Freudian thinking, psychosexual development and the Oedipus complex, reinforce patriarchal values. In his outlining of the key stages of growth in psychosexual development, the glaringly important stages of ménage, the first period, and menstruation are ignored. This perhaps would not be important if the tone set by his lack of attention to even stereotypical female development had been redressed. However, in psychoanalytic literature, there is still currently a well-documented lack of written interest in physical events that have traditionally been seen as pertaining to women, such as menstruation, childbirth, and menopause. Freud's description of the Oedipus complex transparently put women in an inferior position. Indeed, a successful resolution of the Oedipus complex for Freud meant that the girl would come to terms with her inferiority of not having a penis and would content herself with the possibility of having a baby. The relevance of this for the current context is that whilst these theories have been challenged, redescribed, updated, the terms Oedipus complex, Oedipal issues, for example, are still in current usage, but often without the updated version of these terms being given. It is curious that it is acceptable for these terms to still be in use, given the inherent explicit misogyny that they describe. The place of women has been amongst the psychoanalytic theoretical battles, and has been at times prominent, at times less so. But with a striking consistency, there is a remarkable disappearing act that takes place for the women who have taken part in these battles, and more importantly, their contributions have been dismissed or relegated to a special interest, a parallel process to what has happened to women in psychoanalysis. In the one arena where unconscious processes should be thought about, the givens of patriarchy challenged, the world of women has become just that, the world of women, a split-off group separated from the patriarchal norm of men. The fact that writers who challenge the role of women in psychoanalysis either self-label as feminists or are labelled as feminists reflects that the mainstream remains non-representative of women's experiences. The mainstream implicitly is that of Freud's classical psychoanalysis, but tweaked and evolved. For people who have studied or trained in psychotherapy, I would be curious to know how easily they would be able to identify and match the faces on the screen with these names. These women are Karen Horney, Rosemary Balsam, Clara Thompson, Louise Eichenbaum, Susie Orbach, Lucy Regari, Yulia Kristeva, Jessica Benjamin, Julia Mitchell, and Etta Brackinger. To quote the Yale professor of psychiatry, Rosemary Balsam, there is a manic depressive rhythm of response that echoes the classic rhythms of interest in female issues in the upsurge of focus, excitement, and enthusiasm that is followed by a more enduring level of symptomatic ennui on the topic in our field. So in concrete terms, is there evidence for misogyny in psychoanalysis? A helpful starting point might be this definition provided by Kate Mann in her book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. She describes misogyny as the law enforcement branch of patriarchy, a system that functions to police and enforce gendered norms and expectations, and involves girls and women facing disproportionately or distinctively hostile treatment because of their gender, amongst other factors. If we look at some statistics from some of the key psychoanalytic institutions, there may be some indicators of the presence of misogyny, especially when one considers the predominance of women in the fields of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. The International Psychoanalytic Association, founded in 1910 by Freud, since then it has appointed 25 presidents, all of whom were men until the first and only female president was appointed in 2017. The British Psychoanalytic Society, there is a slightly higher presence of women. Of the 30 appointed presidents to date, 8 have been women. According to the UK Council for Psychotherapy, UKCP, in a member survey in 2016, 74% of members are female, 24% are male. Former chairs of the UKCP, since it was formed in 1989 to date, so it shows that out of the 11 chairs that have been in post, 7 have been men, 4 were women. The Mary Sigourney Award, honouring outstanding psychoanalytic achievement worldwide, was eponymously founded by a woman in 1989. Of the awards given to date, 91 of the recipients have been men, 22 women, and 19 organisations received the award. Within the traditional world of British psychoanalysis, much importance is often placed on the analyst's psychoanalytic heritage, for instance, by whom they were analysed during their training, and in turn by whom their analyst was analysed, often hitting the jackpot if the lineage can be traced back to one of the main analysts, such as Klein, Winnicott, Anna Freud, or Sigmund Freud himself. Given that Anna Freud died in 1982, Winnicott in 1971, Klein in 1960, it is possible to have only 1 or 2 degrees of separation from these icons within the field. And of course on trainings, it is writings by these psychoanalysts that are seen as the foundational key texts. Often the reverence given to their writing can make it intimidating for students to do anything but incorporate the writing into their own personal psychoanalytic canon, thereby internalising the misogyny often inherent in the writing. In my book, I detail the journey of a mother and daughter as the mother attempts to get clinical support for her daughter who is encountering certain difficulties as she moves from infancy to being a toddler and then going to school. The daughter has undiagnosed autism. but the mother is continually met with preconceived ideas about her due to her being a mother. Her concern about her daughter is dismissed as maternal anxiety, and she is repeatedly taken as the unreliable narrator of her daughter's needs, primarily because she is continually being met by clinicians' misogynistic beliefs about mothers, which have been unconsciously passed on between generations of psychoanalysts. This internalizing and personal misogyny I have termed the misogynistic introject. It is this negative hallucinating of women that has been well documented in the history of many other disciplines, even more so if the women are of colour. But despite, or perhaps because of, the lack of understanding of women being documented by Freud and the reification of Freud, the negative hallucinating continues unquestioned. On most psychoanalytic training courses, the history of psychoanalysis is given in the same way as history has traditionally been taught, a male whitewash, with the exception of women such as Klein and Anna Freud, who have continued the male narrative in psychoanalysis. In Klein's case, expounding and deepening the misogyny, particularly when it came to looking at menstruation. But as Freud described well, a negative hallucination is a radical defense, and one that should be given full attention. What is needed is for psychoanalysis to take the brave first step of putting itself on the couch to fully grapple with its unconscious fantasies about women and begin coping with what it is working so hard not to see. Thank you.